Good afternoon and welcome to the U.S.-Indonesia Society USINDO Special Open Forum on the first year of the Trump presidency, Outlook and Assessment for 2018. We are honored to have as our moderator for today, Bapak Theo L. Sambuaga, Indonesian Co-Chair of USINDO, President of Lippo Group, and former Head of Commission on Foreign Affairs and Defense, DPR RI. Without further ado, I will hand over the mic to Pak Theo.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm also a co-chairman of the USINDO, so I first welcome you. And before I forgot, I would like also to wish you a very successful of this new year, 2018. We are still in the month of 2018, and also we are coming to welcome the other New Year. That is the Chinese New Year, yeah, in few days. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. And now we are going to have, as we are invited to attend a discussion here, discussion on the first year of President Trump. And now I would like to invite our very important speaker for today's discussion forum. That is Mr. Stephen Okun, please. And Mr. Connelly. I will introduce those two gentlemen in order with their speech. Now, we have in our theme of our discussion that the first year of President Trump in office, and only 1 year in office, President Trump's performance has been eventful, with head-spinning developments that constitute a sharp break from past U.S. policies, practices, and tone over several administrations. Over the past year, the U.S. President, as he pledged during his campaign, has adopted an American-first approach in economic and foreign policy, as shown by his decisions to withdraw from the TPP and the Paris Climate Accords. He succeeded late last year in passing a far-reaching and controversial new tax code, and has cut down regulatory restrictions for businesses in the US, although his earlier effort to repeal the Affordable Care Act was unsuccessful. He has taken an uncompromising stance on preventing North Korea's gaining nuclear weapons production and delivery capability, outlined a strategic vision for protecting the American people in his recently released national security strategy, and made a controversial decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. The style of governmental decision-making and of communicating with the public and press have markedly changed as well. Immigration issue is one of the very top issues he touched upon when he made his State of the Union address only last week. And now, in 2018, the United States will conduct its legislative body's midterm elections, also known as a wave election. Midterm elections have been a determining factor of how the United States will fare nationally and internationally in the second half of the sitting presidency. The US will also participate in a series of important international summits, including the G7, G20, NATO, and United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. President Trump's decisions on the US stance at the international summits will affect many important global issues. As concerned with Asia, President Trump's visit in late 2017 reaffirmed the region's importance of the US. Question remains as to policies his administration will implement in 2018. Of course, now we are having this discussion in Jakarta, the capital city of Indonesia. Indonesia is also much concerned with this development of the US policy in the coming years. Now, as we begin the year of 2018, it's timely to reflect on how has President Trump translated his America First approach in terms of economy, trade, investment, and foreign policies. Now, to discuss these questions, USINDO is delighted to host two experts on US policy and how it is perceived in Southeast Asia. Mr. Stephen Okun, founders and CEO, APAC Advisors, a renowned strategic advisory firm focusing on business and investment, government relations, policy and sustainability, and Aaron, to my left, research fellow, Lowy Institute, a recognized independent international policy think tank based in Sydney, Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, not to further ado, I would like now to start the discussion, and the attendance now for those two speakers. I think those two speakers has much familiar with Indonesia and with also some of the attendants, but I also recognize here the top businessman of Indonesia coming here, top academician, and also diplomat, ambassadors. Used to be ambassadors in area countries like Mr. Ambassador Matondang here coming, and many others also would like to participate in our forum now. Now, I would like to first invite Mr. Okun. Yes. Yeah, okay, please.
You get to start with that.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
So I'm trying to unpackage the first year of the Trump presidency. Let me first say that these slides I'm about to give are slides that I work on with my friend Bruce Melman at a lobbying firm in Washington, D.C. I change them around a bit, and so feel free to take pictures if you want of the slides, but I ask that you not post them on social media or such, because these are just for this audience today. And any mistakes in here, well, I want to give Bruce credit for the ideas. All the mistakes in here are mine. When I start, I want to have a full disclosure. Oh, I gave this presentation, well, a similar one before the election in 2016, and I put this slide up. And I say, look, I want to disclose that, I worked in the Clinton White House, I worked in the Clinton administration, I'm a Democrat, but I want to do this in a fully nonpartisan way. But you can be the judge as to whether or not any of my partisan leanings come out, but I really want to do this as an analysis. So when I put this picture up back in November, one of the people raised their hand, they said, who's in the picture? And I said, what do you mean who's in the picture? I mean, you can see that's, Hillary, right? And you can see the President Clinton just behind. She goes, no, I know who they are. Who's in the picture with her? And I said, well, that's me. And she goes, you looked a lot better back then. So be that as it may, to start off with, people always ask, what's the mood like in Washington? And I think there's two words that really describe partisanship in Washington today. those two words are dumpster fire. Okay, that is American slang. Dumpster fire, it means that something is a complete disaster, or it's something that is very difficult that nobody wants to deal with. And that's the situation that we're facing in Washington right now. And why is that? It's because both sides, both Democrats and Republicans, think they're winning after the first year of the Trump presidency, and each plans to double down. So as bad as 2017 was from a partisanship perspective, 2018 is already shaping up to be worse. Okay, so why is this, right? Even before I was born, the most popular television show in the United States was Father Knows Best. And this was a very typical way of how Americans were back 50 years ago, right? You had the mom, you had the white family, it was the dad who worked, the mom stayed at home, and you had the cute kids, and you had this nuclear family. And that's what the United States was in the 50s and 60s. But today, right, on the most popular TV show is Modern Family. So what is Modern Family? The Modern Family is that you have a divorced couple, an older man married to a younger Hispanic woman with a Hispanic kid. You have a gay couple, right? Two men married to one another, adopted a Vietnamese kid, and then you have a somewhat dysfunctional family that still has that nuclear family. That's much more what the United States is like today. So we've gone through these amazing demographic changes in the last 50 years. We have become the United States. We're much more diverse. We're much more foreign-born. We have people who are white, no college is a lot less. So those blue-collar workers who never had a college degree, that made up 3/4 of the country back 50 years ago. That's less than 40% today. Women in the workforce, much more. Economic disparity, much greater. So you have all of these demographic changes. And the people who are being left behind, who Hillary kind of referred to in quote-unquote the deplorables, right? That is really changing what's happening with our electorate. So you have to understand this to understand how President Trump came to office to begin with. The second thing that happened is that our presidents, our politicians are not trusted nearly as much as they used to be. And that's because presidents of both sides have said things that turned out not to be true, and that's being generous, or knew it wasn't true when they said it. You could say Barack Obama, during the healthcare debate, he said, you can keep your healthcare plan under the new law. That wasn't true. Dick Cheney said, we'll be greeted as liberators when we go into Baghdad. That wasn't true. Bill Clinton said, I did not lie, I did not have sexual relations with that woman. Not true. George H.W. Bush, read my lips, no new taxes. We ended up with new taxes. All of this over time has led to this distrust that we Americans have for our politicians on both sides of the aisle. And while this was going on, we don't have honest brokers anymore. It used to be that the most trusted man in the United States of America in 1972 was Walter Cronkite, and who was the anchor on the evening news. Now, people believe the news is partisan, and so you have the Republicans who watch Fox, and you have the Democrats who watch MSNBC, and they don't trust what they hear anymore. So when we no longer have this common set of facts, and you get people who buy into this, fake news, which President Trump has used to great effect. And I'll say the last thing that I want to talk about very briefly is something called gerrymandering. Now, gerrymandering is a term that goes back to the 1812s in the United States. So gerrymandering is as old as the United States is. But what gerrymandering does is it gives you the ability to set up Congress so that you have these very safe seats, and seats become very Republican or very Democratic. And so we'll take the state of Pennsylvania, which is very much in the news now for this. So Pennsylvania has 18 seats that go to the House of Representatives in the United States. Now, Pennsylvania should have about half being Democrats and half being Republicans. And that's because when Pennsylvania votes, congressionally, 51% vote for Democrats and 49% vote for Republicans. And when you would have that overlap, and when you would have these competitive races, you'd have people who would be willing to work together across the aisle. But what has happened, and if you can see, the Republicans have controlled how the lines get drawn in Pennsylvania. So I picked out the most egregious of the example of gerrymandering in Pennsylvania. And this is a map of the 7th Congressional District. And as you can see, if you look back in 1952, it was kind of like a circle. And this was the way it was structured, so that sometimes a Republican won, sometimes a Democrat won. What's happened over the time is that the Republicans have redrawn the seats to have as many Republicans be in Congress. And that bottom graphic is what the 7th District looks like today. Now what it's called is, people say that looks more, instead of like a congressional district, it looks more like Donald Duck kicking Goofy. Right? We shouldn't have congressional districts drawn up to look like Disney characters. But that's what's happened. And so what this means is that those people in those districts become very Republican, very conservative if they're Republicans, very liberal if they're Democrats. And this is what's happened to our Congress over time. So the top red for Republican, the bottom blue for Democrats, is that it used to be that the median Democrat was, it was more liberal than conservative, but they were somewhere in the middle. Today, the median Democrat is almost consistently liberal, and the median Republican is almost consistently conservative. So there's very limited ability to work across the aisle. And that's why we have this gridlock, and everything has to get done by party line votes. And it's this type of partisanship, when you couple with the media, and you couple it with the demographic changes, and you couple with people feeling that they want to go back to the way things were, where they want to make America great again, you end up with this chart. Right? So going back from Eisenhower, who was president right after World War II, up to, really certainly Jimmy Carter, the gap between how Democrats and Republicans thought about their own president was about 30%. So as an example, for Jimmy Carter, if his popularity rating was 60%, there was only a 30% difference between how Democrats thought of him, so it would be like 75-45, right? And that would get you to 60. And so that was like that whether it was a Democrat was president or a Republican was president. If a Democrat was president, some Republicans liked him. And if a Republican was president, some Democrats liked him. That started to stop with Reagan, and it's only accelerated ever since. So when Barack Obama was president, there was a difference of 70% between how Democrats and Republicans thought of him. With Trump, it's 77%. And this is why we are getting the policies that we're getting out of Washington right now. And so when you go into this, right, some people will think that Donald Trump is on a real winning streak if you look at what he was able to accomplish in his first year. And so, and for that reason, the Democrats, the Republicans love Trump. Now we all say, oh, well, how can Trump be popular with what he's doing on Twitter and all the things he's saying? He's extremely popular with the Republican base. And he said back during the campaign, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose voters. That basically is true, right? And Trump understands that. And that's what enables him to say and do what he does without any political repercussion to his base, which are Republicans. He has been very consistent in that about 80% of Republican voters continue to approve of the job he is doing. And because of that number, the Republicans who control the House and the Senate go along with whatever he wants to do. And that leads to all of these things happening that he considers and the Republicans consider to be winning. Tax reform is one. Getting rid of the individual mandate in Obamacare is a second one. Putting more and more conservatives into our judiciary, right? Rolling back regulations. All of these things that he has been able to do is because of the popularity he still has with the base. Now, most Americans may not like this, but the Republicans do. And so he is winning in that regard. Now he's also losing at the same time. His approval rating in 2017 never got above 40, basically never got above 40% going forward with May. He started at 45 right after the inauguration, and he's hovered in the 30s. This is historically low in the United States. No president in their first year has been under 40%. Only two have even been under 50% after year one. And Trump, today, the last time I checked, Trump is at 40%. So what this means, when you have a very unpopular president, but who has total control of the legislative and executive branches, you have just a lot of anger. And so the Democrats, their base is becoming hyper-energized. They're winning the elections that have taken place since Trump won, and they've been able to block him on two of the things he really wants, which is Obamacare and getting that border wall built. We'll see what happens in 2018. Because this is the year that we have midterm elections. And the House and the Senate are up for grabs. And if the Republicans lose the House and or the Senate, it is going to change everything for the next 2 years. The best predictor of how the House is going to go in a midterm election is the popularity of the president. So if the president's popularity is above 60%, that president is likely to gain seats in the House. If it's between 50 to 60, they're going to lose, but on average they lose 12 seats. And that's because we Americans like divided government. We don't like to have the same people in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House. So we like some gridlock in our system. So you usually lose in a midterm. But when his popularity, which is under 50%, when it's under 50%, the average loss is 40 seats. If the Republicans lose 40 seats in the House, they lose the House to the Democrats. And his approval rating, I looked 2 days ago, is 40%. And so the Republicans, on any historical basis, should lose the House come November. Now, they may keep the House. The reason they would keep the House is because of that gerrymandering and making seats very safe that they've been able to do. Midterm elections, the people who come out to vote are typically older and whiter, and they are more conservative, so it's possible that they can hold on to their majority, and they have more money than the Democrats. So it is possible that the Republicans keep the House, but how this goes is going to dictate what's going to happen for the last 2 years. And then the Senate is right now 51-49. If you look at how a third of the Senate is up every 6 years, of those seats that are up, there's more Democratic seats up than Republican seats up. So the Democrats have to, basically, you want to use a card analogy, pull an inside straight to be able to get the Senate. But it's possible. It all depends on who the Republicans nominate. So what is it that we're going to see going forward from the Trump administration? Right now, went back when my time in the Clinton administration, we were not very popular, more popular than Trump, but we were not very popular in about year one of the administration. The president's approval ratings after 6 months were underwater. And that meant more people disapproved of Bill Clinton than approved of him. And that's because Whitewater was going on, NAFTA had happened, tax increases were coming, and so what did the Clinton administration do to retool and be in a position to win in a second term? Retooled White House operations, brought the country together after Oklahoma City, pivoted to the center on policy, which we'll talk about in a second, had a great economy, and we, the Clinton administration, were able to leverage a very unpopular foil, and that was Newt Gingrich at the time. And so the question is, will the Trump administration take a page out of the Clinton playbook? And that requires a pivot to the center. Now, as they say, meanwhile back on planet Earth, I don't think that's going to happen. But if it could happen, this is what the president would do. They would focus on infrastructure, because that's something that I think the people in Washington, D.C. and people in Jakarta feel the same way when we sit in our traffic and we look at our roads and our electrical infrastructure. It needs a lot of money and it needs a lot of work. We're all in agreement on that. That's something Democrats and Republicans could get behind. Immigration. There's an agreement that we have to protect those dreamers, which we could talk about later if you want, but we also need to beef up border security. That's an area where there's potential compromise. There's other issues that there's a lot of opportunity for compromise. The question is, can that happen in our hyper-partisan world? The answer is, unfortunately, probably not. And that's because those voters who were for Trump have remained for Trump. So the voters, the Republican voters who voted for Trump, as opposed to those who voted against Hillary but casted a vote for Trump, those Republican voters who voted for Trump still would vote for him again. 97% of them said, I did the right thing, I will vote for him again, even after everything we went through in the last year. And so while they stay firmly behind Trump, the Democrats are moving left. So if you look at where Clinton was in 1994, and you look at where the Democrats are today, and that's Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, the Democratic Party has become much more liberal. It's become much more liberal on trade, it's become more liberal on health care, it's become more liberal on criminal justice reform. And so all of these things are pushing the Democrats left while the Republicans stay completely behind Trump. So what does that mean? What's going to happen next? That's my picture up there in case you don't recognize it. All right, so what's going to happen next? Trump has never left primary mode from day one. The typical way you run for office and govern in the US is if you're a Democrat, you run in the primary to the left because most of the voters in the primary are liberal. And if you're a Republican, you run to the right because the primary voters are more conservative. Then when you get the nomination, you tack to the center. So you go from the left to the center or to the right to the center. Trump has never moved off of this populism, nationalism, anti-establishmentism that he's been with. There's no reason to believe he is going to change with that. And the Democrats have a real struggle in terms of the party. But right now, the left and the don't work with Trump in any way, shape, or form is really holding strong. And so unfortunately, I think 2018 is even going to be worse than 2017 in terms of the two sides working together. And it all depends on what the Republicans can do on their own, controlling the executive branch, doing it through the regulatory process, doing things without requiring 60 votes, which is tough in the Senate. We're going to get more and more of the same. But there's many wild cards. What happens with North Korea? What happens if we get into a trade war with China? What happens if the stock market collapses? What's going to happen if Paul Manafort flips and if Mueller finds more and more, gets more and more people to plead guilty in his investigations? So all of these wild cards are out there. Now, I've only talked about the domestic piece because I'm going to turn over to Aaron now to talk about all of these riskiest global challenges that we face today. And what it is that the Trump administration did in year one and how it's going to address those going forward. Aaron?
Thank you very much, Mr. Okun. Mr. Okun, as we also known as a chairman and founder and CEO of APAC Advisors, and he spent more than 20 years, almost 20 years, in the administration and campaign of the US president, particularly the serving administration of President Bill Clinton from 1994 to 1999, and worked on numerous political campaigns, including the US presidential campaign in 1988, 1996, and 2000. That's why his observer, you can see by yourself that is very sharp about the political situation in the United States, particularly now. And he is also the guest lectures at universities across Asia, frequently quoted in media, as well as having been published in the Straits Times and the Business Times. And Mr. Okun received his BA from University of Virginia and his JD from the University of Virginia School of Law. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Okun. And now I would like to hand this opportunity to Mr. Aaron Connelly, please.
Thank you, Pak Theo. This is a real honor to be able to speak at USINDO. I'm going to sit because I'm not as sprightly as Steve, but we've decided to split up the discussion into domestic and foreign policy. So I'm going to really limit my remarks to East Asia policy in particular. And I think there's an interesting story to tell about East Asia policy, but we have to be upfront about who President Trump is and views that he holds. Oftentimes, Republican commentators, when they talk about President Trump, they will try to sort of reconcile the things that he said, the views that he holds, and in his effort at cognitive dissonance, they will try and make the argument that he didn't really mean what he said, or what he actually meant was this, or what he said is not that unusual because it's happened before in some other setting. But I think we need to be realistic about the fact that President Trump is far outside the mainstream of the Republican Party in terms of foreign policy views that its leaders have held for generations. He is deeply skeptical of alliances. He is also deeply skeptical, and Tom Wright at Brookings Institution has done great work on this. He is deeply skeptical of multilateral trade agreements, which is something that Republicans have been behind for a generation. And he is also, but to a lesser extent, skeptical of democratic institutions, and he seems to admire and enjoy the company of strongmen. That's not as unusual for Republicans, but it's still quite unusual compared to the ones that we've seen in the White House in recent years. So that's who President Trump is. But the interesting thing that has happened, Steve, do you have that clicker? Thank you. The interesting thing that we've seen over the last year is the way that his policy, that his preferred policies, have failed to be implemented in this region. We have a saying in Washington that personnel is policy. And so the people you appoint to key positions tend to have an extraordinary influence over the policy that is actually implemented in Washington. And President Trump is in a unique position. Because he is our first president without any public sector, military, or civilian experience. He doesn't have a deep knowledge of how the system works. And I don't think I'm being partisan in saying this, he also does not have a deep subject matter knowledge of these issues in East Asia. One Southeast Asian diplomat told me that when his leader met with President Trump, President Trump asked his counterpart to explain to him the difference between APEC and the East Asia Summit a couple of times, because he couldn't quite get it, couldn't quite understand how they were different. So he doesn't actually have the subject matter knowledge to implement his instincts in East Asia policy that some of his predecessors have had, and certainly that President Obama acquired very quickly. So that's who President Trump is. And so the story of East Asia policy in 2017 has really been a struggle between President Trump and the America First advisors who came into office with him, and then the people who he has put in charge of key institutions at the State Department, the Defense Department, the National Security Council. So it's worth talking about those people in terms of the Trump administration National Security Council. For those of you who don't know, Mike Flynn was indeed appointed National Security Advisor. He had the shortest tenure of any National Security Advisor in U.S. history, to about 25 days. He's since been charged in a federal court in Washington. He's likely to officially become a felon in a very short amount of time. Rudolph Giuliani, former mayor of New York City, particularly during 9/11, holds views on things like the counterterrorism that run to the wrong side of the Geneva Conventions, and he was a likely attorney general. John Bolton, who was President Bush's ambassador to the United Nations and also an undersecretary of state during the first George W. Bush administration, holds very aggressive views on North Korea and the North Korea issue. He was a likely secretary of state. Peter Navarro was Trump's top trade advisor during the campaign, and he was named during the transition to head up a new White House council. And in Washington, the White House councils are extraordinarily important. The Domestic Policy Council, which is led by an assistant to the president and brings people from all over government to implement domestic policy, and the National Security Council, as well as some other more minor councils, they all hold tremendous sway over policy. And so it appeared that Navarro, when the administration got underway, would hold tremendous sway over manufacturing and trade policy in a way that no one else had in the White House in some time. And then, of course, we had Steve Bannon, who was named a principal on the National Security Council. I worked for President Clinton's National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, who had to fight to make sure that President Clinton did not give George Stephanopoulos the same role in the Clinton White House. And Steve Hadley, who was President George W. Bush's National Security Advisor, fought to make sure that Karl Rove did not have that role in the Bush White House. So there's a long-standing precedent that you do not name political advisors to the National Security Council as principals. They might sit on meetings on occasion, but they certainly weren't driving policy. And so the fact that President Trump is going to name Steve Bannon to the Principals Council of the National Security Council was a pretty big deal. And this is what we were looking at on the first day after the election. Giuliani didn't really pass vetting during the transition. Bolton also, it appeared, could not be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. let's keep in mind that the Republicans have a majority in the US Senate. President Trump doesn't really. There are a number of Republicans who don't support his agenda, and particularly do not support an America First agenda. And so some of these people couldn't be confirmed. And Peter Navarro has really been sidelined. Unlike the real Domestic Policy Council, National Security Council with staffs in the dozens or hundreds, Navarro has a staff of one, who's a 25-year-old former congressional aide. And Politico in July of last year reported that he had taken to stalking the West Wing on weekends in the hopes that he might run into President Trump and get a word with him on policy. So he's really been sidelined in a pretty extraordinary way. And of course, Steve Bannon, he was taken off the National Security Council in April after a new National Security Advisor was appointed, and then he was fired in August, and now he's really persona non grata both in the White House and in the conservative movement more generally. So that would have been an America First administration. This is what we ended up getting. And I feel like we're incredibly lucky that we got what we did. This is a mainstream Republican administration. H.R. McMaster is a leading foreign policy intellectual who is well regarded on both sides of the political aisle. We'll talk a little bit about his views on North Korea later, which have eroded some of that respect. Rex Tillerson was an interesting choice for Secretary of State, but was sort of renowned for his management abilities. There were question marks about his policy views. In actuality, it's turned out to be the other way around. He's been widely panned in the State Department for mismanaging, particularly this reorganization that he wanted to drive. But his policy views have turned out to be incredibly conventional. He's not sort of a buddy of Vladimir Putin as he was originally portrayed. He has executed Russian sanctions bills up until recently pretty effectively. Jim Mattis, another beloved military figure, respected on both sides of the aisle, and appears to be able to basically define his own policy at the Defense Department without a lot of intervention from President Trump. President Trump has enormous respect for him. Some of this may merely be because Mattis's nickname was rumored to be Mad Dog. Turns out it's not actually Mad Dog, but Trump thought it was, and he liked the nickname. He said he liked the nickname when he appointed Mattis to be Secretary of Defense. So he has this kind of tough Marine exterior, but Mattis is actually a scholar who reads. There's a famous story about one of his second lieutenants in the Marine Corps telling him, "Sir, I don't have time to read. I have to lead my men." And Mattis saying, "Well, if you don't have time to read, you don't have time to lead your men." So he's a scholar who cares deeply about ideas and reads quite a bit. Nikki Haley, who was governor of South Carolina, was widely praised for driving the compromise that brought down the Confederate flag over the South Carolina state capitol. Appointed ambassador to the UN, really a novice at foreign policy, but surrounds herself with traditional Republican foreign policy thinkers. And except for those moments where she seems to be currying favor with President Trump by saying something in an America First way, she has actually been quite conventional in her views, and she's been very tough on Russia in particular, which surprised a lot of people. And at the UN, it's pretty important. And then, of course, Mike Pence, who played a key role in foreign policy early in the administration, he's backed off with that a little bit now. Pence, again, a novice in foreign policy, doesn't have a lot of experience. He's a former governor of Indiana, House Majority Whip in Washington, but he surrounds himself with traditional Republican foreign policy advisors. He made his first trips to Asia to reemphasize that the Trump administration is not going to break with alliances with South Korea and with Japan. And he and at least his people felt strongly about getting to Indonesia early on. And from all accounts, I think that visit went quite well for a Republican vice president who had run on a fairly, well, shall we say, unorthodox platform with his running mate, particularly in terms of relations with Muslims in the United States. So that's what we ended up getting. In terms of policy, I've also been a little bit surprised. President Trump during the campaign and since he's been in office has been a really revisionist president on trade policy. This was probably the most revisionist issue he had during the campaign, and it really threatened to wreck relations with countries in East Asia because of the importance that we place on trade in this region. And on his third day in office, he withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There's no question about it. That was a huge blow to U.S. reputation. It was an agreement that took 8 years to negotiate, a little bit more than 8 years to negotiate, and which those countries which were a part of it had made a lot of sacrifices in order to be able to do, particularly Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam. So withdrawing from that was a big blow, and it was certainly an America First policy. There's no question about that. But what else did he say he would do? He said during the campaign, he told New York Times reporters that he would put 45% tariffs on Chinese goods. basically starting a trade war with China. He said he would declare China a currency manipulator. He said this multiple times at rallies throughout the campaign. And since he's been in office, he's threatened to withdraw from the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement at a time when we're trying to keep our South Korean ally on one side in negotiations with North Korea. That would be tremendously disruptive. And I think this has gotten too little attention, but he's also said that he wants to use national security waiver to levy tariffs on steel. The national security waiver is in the WTO. The Uruguay round agreed to a national security waiver, but it's never been used since the WTO was created. So it could have a very disruptive effect in the international trading system. Other countries could start to use national security waivers when they're not really required. And we can have a debate about whether or not steel actually requires a national security tariffs or not, but I think most people who work on this and have deep knowledge of it would say that it does not. And so that was what he talked about doing. But what has he actually done? He hasn't done any of those four things. He has talked about, obviously he's talked about bilateral free trade agreements, particularly in the Asia Pacific. There haven't been a lot of takers. I thought Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong was quite good on this when he came to Washington in October. He said that the idea seems to be that you, America, want bilateral trade agreements because you're bigger than everybody else, and therefore you can bully them in negotiations. And surprise, surprise, not a lot of countries want to enter that negotiation. And so there hasn't been a lot of movement on that, and I don't expect there to be. And of course, there's been a renegotiation of NAFTA, and that could have repercussions in this region as well. But it's still under negotiation, and I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with an agreement that looks surprisingly similar to the North American provisions of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was effectively a renegotiation of NAFTA anyways. So this is a harder line trade policy than we would have expected from George W. Bush or from Barack Obama or from Bill Clinton, but it is not outside the mainstream of Republican foreign policy. It's a pretty mainstream Republican foreign policy trade agenda, if to the right of it. On North Korea, which has been in the headlines quite a bit, partly because Trump keeps putting it there with his tweets, we've also seen, and perhaps this is a more controversial thesis, but a pretty conventional North Korea policy. Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson constantly say that the era of strategic patience is over. Strategic patience was Barack Obama's North Korea policy. But the idea behind strategic patience was that the United States would not resume negotiations with North Korea until it went back to the status quo circa 2008, before the Obama administration came into office. And in fact, what we've seen is a continuation of that policy. To some extent, it's the demands on the US side have become more extreme. Mike Pence at one point said they have to go back to 1994 instead of just 2008. But in recent months, they've softened that and they've said, no, they just have to suspend missile tests for 60 days. So we're still seeing a version of strategic patience. We'll talk a little bit about whether or not this can continue when we get to the 2018 slide, but that's effectively the North Korea policy that we've seen. And Matt Pottinger, who you see here in this photo with President Moon, has really been driving that policy and has pretty deep knowledge of the North Korea issue. I don't think President Trump's tweets are helpful. I think they can be destabilizing. I don't think they, in and of themselves, are going to start a nuclear war. When I talk to Chinese diplomats about this, they dismiss the idea that President Trump is going to start going to issue a surprise attack order on North Korea. They say, unless he's doing an evacuation of American citizens or at the very least military dependence from South Korea, that's pretty unlikely. But it's a pretty conventional policy. On democracy and human rights, I couldn't fit democracy and human rights in that small text, so I did the Indonesian abbreviation. But on democracy and human rights, we've also seen a fairly conventional policy. Although President Trump himself, again, appears very comfortable with strongmen, and this is him with Hun Sen from Cambodia, and giving a thumbs up signal with Hun Sen, which is hard to imagine President Obama doing or President Bush doing, certainly even President George H.W. Bush. While he appears enamored with strongmen, he doesn't spend a lot of time on policy with regard to those particular strongmen, with the exception of Xi Jinping. And so the policy has actually been driven by people below his level, and Matt Pottinger and Patrick Murphy at the State Department and Rex Tillerson all pressured Cambodia at this same meeting that this photo was taken at the East Asia Summit in November to release Kem Sokha, the opposition leader. And it's just one example of the way that the policy has diverged. At the head of state level, it's very comfortable with autocrats. It's very comfortable with violations of human rights and democracy. That's part of President Trump's viewpoint, his worldview. But at the implementation level, we actually see a lot of pressure on these countries to free dissidents. Rex Tillerson went to Myanmar to talk about the Rohingya issue. I dare say he's had a little bit more success than Ibu Retno in terms of dealing with the Myanmar government on that issue. So it's actually been a pretty active foreign policy below the presidential level. And then finally on Southeast Asia, President Obama really made a mark in terms of showing up at the East Asia Summit. Indonesia, by the way, was key to America's inclusion at the East Asia Summit. It's something that is worth remembering anytime anyone says that the Indonesia-U.S. partnership fell short during the Obama administration. But at the end of the Obama administration, there was a little bit less attention on Southeast Asia. He was still showing up at summits, but there wasn't as much movement in the bilateral relations. And we had a really tough time with the Philippines and with Thailand, which had both elected or, in one case, elected itself, much more conservative governments, much more illiberal governments. President Trump, not caring quite so much about those issues, has enabled bureaucracy to reach out to those countries and to do more on a bilateral level with Southeast Asian countries. My understanding is that Kemlu is actually much happier with Rex Tillerson as Secretary of State than they ever were with John Kerry, that Ibu Retno couldn't get John Kerry to pick up her phone calls, but Tillerson does. And so while the administration may not have the sort of vision that the Obama administration had, that Kirk Campbell designed with the pivot and the rebalance, it's at least listening to Southeast Asian countries a little bit more. And so I think there's an opportunity for improvement in relations with individual countries. I hope that there's still an emphasis on democracy and human rights, even as the level of relations increases, and that I think that's still to be seen. Just quickly, in terms of what we can expect in the future, I think 2018 will really test a lot of these hypotheses that I've put to you. Some of them it's possible that Trump hasn't had a big effect on his East Asia policy just because he hadn't had a lot of time yet. But we are a quarter into the administration, so it's getting a little bit late to have an impact. The two issues that I would point to are North Korea and trade. The trade team is a little bit more settled in. They have the NAFTA renegotiation underway. The U.S. Trade Representative, Lighthizer, is known for not consulting with his interagency colleagues before he takes action, and so he almost convinced President Trump to break the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement in late August before Mattis and McMaster and the generals who surround him convinced him that that would be a terrible thing to do at a time when we're dealing with the North Korea crisis. But it's possible that Lighthizer may be able to, for instance, get Trump to sign a national security waiver for steel. I think that would be really damaging. That would be an America First policy, and we'd have to sort of reevaluate this thesis that trade has actually been fairly mainstream up until this point. And then on North Korea, it's become clear just in the last 2 weeks that the administration's talk about a so-called bloody nose strike, which would not seek to completely take out the North Korean regime, but seek to convince them that the United States is serious about the nuclear issue. It's clear that some people in the Trump administration are seriously considering that possibility, and that Victor Cha, who works at CSIS Washington and is their Korea chair and was due to become ambassador to Seoul, that he was not comfortable with that, and as a result, he's no longer under consideration to be ambassador. And so that reveals a pretty hard line of the administration, and perhaps that the hardliners on North Korea are getting a little bit more of an upper hand. And so I think it's very important, and I know Australia's been sending these messages as well as other countries, that countries in the Asia Pacific communicate to the Trump administration just how devastating that would be for the relationship with Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and for the economic situation in the region. Perhaps President Trump, with the crash in the stock market or the correction in the stock market recently, is more focused on things that could actually throw the economic situation out of balance, because he tends to brag on that quite a bit. I'll stop there, and I'm very interested in taking your questions. I don't get up to Indonesia as much as I like, so I'm very interested in the perspective from here and whether or not you all would challenge any of those premises or you see opportunities that perhaps I haven't seen. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Pak Theo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aaron Connelly. Yes, Mr. Aaron Connelly, as a research fellow in the East Asia program at the Lowy Institute, a recognized independent international policy think tank based in Sydney. And before working in this institute, Lowy Institute, he also worked at Albright Stonebridge Group, a commercial diplomacy consultancy headquartered in Washington. As a director of the firm, he assisted companies and non-profits in understanding political risk to investment and operations in Southeast Asia. As special assistant to the chair of the firm, former U.S. National Security Advisor Sambuaga, Mr. Connelly collaborated closely with Mr. Berger on foreign policy matters, conducting research for and representing him in a variety of outside initiatives, including those regarding the U.S. role in East Asia. Previously, he worked at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Washington, as a Fulbright Scholar and Visiting Fellow of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, in Jakarta, and a consultant of U.S. firm operating in Southeast Asia with Lippo Group Asia. He earned his master's degree from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and a bachelor degree from Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. He also studied philosophy, politics, and economics in Pembroke College, Oxford. Thank you, Mr. Connelly. And now, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, distinguished participants, we are now open for discussion, Q&A. And then I see a lot of intention and for the attendance here. Now I would like to make me a list. First, the gentleman. Okay, and then, okay, I would like also before, three. Okay, let's start. Please, gentlemen, and please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunities. My name is Firdausi from Universitas Pajajaran. I have several questions, if it's not too long. Because we are talking about the Trump administration, so I was curious about what actually the ideology of Trump. I mean, like, what is the original of his political ideology? Is it always more like now, or is it because they are just following what is trend, or is it because he just wants to be different? Because it seems like not just in the US but also in all over the world, even in Indonesia, the trend of political identity is increasing. And also curious, when I comparing with how the political party form in the US and compare with some countries in Europe, do you like in Republican Party, do you see that which one actually more dominant from time to time, or even now? Is it more like far right extreme, or is it more like conservative? Because like when you see, for example, the example like in Germany, in France, or in the UK, usually the conservative and then the far right extreme is a bit they form different political party. Also, do you see there is any chance of impeachment as a result of Russia involvement in the political campaign? And do you see that the Middle East policy will give a huge effect on the Trump? Because it sounds now like a bit like maze, because Saudi Arabia wants to needs the support, and then maybe there will be a help for Saudi Arabia to agree what the Israel proposed, but because they don't want to get less influence between the conflict of Shia and Sunni with Iran. And then last, because you mentioned about the because you mentioned about the influence between US and then Southeast Asia. Do you see this is because of the trend of the investment? Because I get the data from my friend who worked for the policy center. They say that US is not top of the investor in Indonesia anymore. That's what she said. Yeah, I think that's all for now. Thank you.
Thank you. And the lady over there. Yeah, in the middle, please.
Terima kasih. Boryati from Walton Family Foundation. So you put up a chart, Steve, about the Republican base and kind of changes. I don't know if that was over Trump's presidency or going back further, but are there already sort of estimates about, is his base shrinking? Those people who lean Republican, are they, still leaning Republican? Are they not going to turn out for the election? I know these are all questions you can only sort of predict, but whatever the indications are at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you. Before I continue, I would like to announce something from the staff. That's untuk sesi ini Q&A. Kami juga minta atau mengencourage supaya teman-teman pers dapat menggunakan waktu untuk bertanya, karena sesudah ini tidak ada lagi sesi meeting the press tersendiri, jadi press meeting, jadi langsung di join meeting between the press meeting and this Q&A answer. So please, if you would like to answer question here, it is also the opportunity to. Okay, and now, Pak Franz. Pak Franzanto is a senior pilot of Garuda.
Thank you, Pak. I'm a senior citizen. Good afternoon. Directly to Mr. Okun, the pundit here. And you were saying earlier that Trump's base won't budge no matter what's going to happen in the mid-election here. And then I was just wondering if, has there been any history in America where invoking the 25th based on mental illness? Thank you.
Pak Sofyan, Dr. Sofyan, please.
I'm Sofyan Allah from the IPMI Business School. Oh, by the way, Pak, I am the most senior citizen around here. Oh, yeah. 78 and a half. I'd like to ask our two speakers about something that has been bothering me ever since this Mr. Trump ran for the presidency and now has been president for what year? I lived in the United States for 14 years. My sons were born and grew up there. Somehow, we got to know many Americans, the so-called average Americans, kind-hearted, warm, expect other people highly. And now, all of a sudden, this guy Trump got elected. Please explain to me. I'm puzzled, really. It's not the American that I know, that I used to know. As I said earlier, average American, very polite, honest, big-hearted, warm, and then came this guy. Please, explain something to me so that I can sleep well this evening. Thank you.
Any other? Pak Ambassador? Oh, okay, sure. Oke, oh. Ini kalau ada wartawan mau bertanya silakan juga ya.
Saya bahasa Indonesia boleh?
Boleh.
Nama saya Lufti Susanto, saya dari Arisan Market di Stock Exchange, Pak. Cuma saya juga sering baca di koran mengenai kebijakan khusus Amerika dari Trump. Mungkin bisa ditranslate ya. Itu first Amerika yang dicanangkan oleh Trump itu sebuah proteksi dari Amerika karena kalah dalam perdagangan dengan negara-negara Asia, terutama Cina, Korea, dengan Jepang. Itu bahkan dia kebijakan di koran itu kan diangkat pajak tax untuk menghadang daripada kalahnya Amerika dengan Asia. Nah, kalau sampai itu terjadi berarti Amerika
to protect and to fight the Japanese and China.
Berarti kan secara tidak langsung Amerika itu menodai daripada liberalisasi perdagangan yang dicanangkan oleh dia, Pak. Kan Amerika itu liberal. Tapi setelah dia kalah, tapi justru dia jadi nasionalis dalam ekonomi. Gitu loh, Pak. Nah, dampak dari First Amerika ini apakah akan berpengaruh ke Indonesia? Dan Indonesia adalah negara muslim terbesar dunia dan itu masih tumbuh. Dan itu ada tesis yaitu kemudian demokrasi dengan Islam itu bisa bersatu. Kalau itu gagal dan akan berdampak ke negara Islam yang lainnya. Dan Indonesia harus dijaga dengan pertumbuhan ekonomi. Kalau Indonesia nanti diproteksi seperti negara-negara yang lain dan demokrasi gagal di sini karena ekonomi tidak naik, itu akan merugikan Amerika juga ke depan. Karena di sini negara muslim terbesar di dunia dan harus diperhatikan. Tidak bisa diperlakukan seperti negara-negara yang sudah kuat. Struktur manufakturnya kita masih tumbuh. Dan yang diangkat cukup banyak. Gitu loh, Pak. Nah, First Amerika ini akan berdampak ke kita nggak? Apakah sebuah anugerah atau sebuah malapetaka di sini, Pak? Dalam ekonomi, karena tidak bisa lepas daripada ekonomi. Kalau ekonomi oleng, ya Indonesia akan hancur juga, gitu loh, Pak. Ke depannya. Jadi First Amerika itu akan kemana untuk Indonesia? Dan untuk Asia Tenggara. Tapi khususnya untuk Indonesia, akan kemana ini First Amerika? Apakah mengarah pada proteksi juga kayak kita juga? Kalau menghantam kita juga, ekspor kita kalah, Pak. Sama Vietnam katanya kalah. Sama Malaysia kita kalah, sama apalagi sama Singapura gitu loh, Pak. Mereka berdua di atas 200 miliar dolar. Dan ini kan akan berdampak ke ekonomi juga, Pak. Pertumbuhan ekonomi juga kita kalah. Kita 5,07. Filipina 7. Vietnam tuh 6,9. Gitu loh, Pak. Dari skala ekonomi kita udah kalah sama Asia Tenggara. Apakah itu kekalahan daripada kesalahan kita atau First Amerika ini juga pengaruh, gitu loh, Pak? Saya ngomong gini agar demokrasi ini bisa kawin di sini dan menjadi tesis untuk negara-negara seluruh dunia, Pak.
Thank you.
Ya, waalaikumsalam.
Thanks. What is the impact of the First America to Indonesia and Southeast Asia?
I'm confident with the economy in Indonesia. If you look at the outlook of 2018, because the focus of the Indonesian economy is as soon as possible we reach what we call it income per capita P. That is the focus of the Jokowi presidency. The next 5 years, hopefully, he will be elected. So that's our focus. And if you are mentioned about President Trump address to certain topics, we have to divide between for the domestic consumption, but also for the foreign consumption. But I think that maybe Mr. Trump at that time think that it is for the domestic consumption, but he overlooked that it has a big impact to the international, like say about the Jerusalem topics. That is good for the domestic consumption. That's why they don't have any impact on both for the Democratic and both for the Republic. But they have big effect in the international. In regarding to China's economic, it is not true that America lose to Chinese. We have to understand that America needs Chinese and Chinese need America. America need import from China because it is maintain their economic, especially they control the consumption of the people. But at the same time, America can import industrial goods, say for the what's called it the high-tech product. So we have to be realistic, but also open-minded. That's my comment. Thank you.
Okay. I also someone. Okay. Pak Ambassador ya, please Pak. Ini dari jauh kita juga udah makin tua Pak, nggak begitu kenal. Terus kita mantan Dubes Indonesian Ambassador to Bangkok.
Thank you, moderator. I'm also the senior citizen here, and I'm lucky, to in this age, observe the new president in the United States, quite different with the previous presidents. What I want to raise in this juncture is the question that raised by the latest issue of the Foreign Affairs magazines. The magazine issue an article entitling "Is President Trump normal foreign policy president?" Because in the end of the analysis of the article, it mentioned that in the 2017 President Donald Trump more luckier than the 2018, because the lucky and the worst will be coming in the 2018. And one thing that I also mentioned about the increasing of the United States depending on nuclear arsenals. The latest issue on nuclear posture review, that President Donald Trump will compete things based on nuclear power with other nuclear power country like China and Russia or even North Korea. So it will be a dangerous step in 2018 and forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pak. And now we come to the masih ada satu lagi. Please, Pak, before we have the speakers to comment on this, please.
Steve Liebevec from Richmond, Virginia. First, I would like to say to Pak Sofyan that certainly we think that there are still many Americans that are kind-hearted, and we're just trying to figure out how to get back on top. My question is, we've withdrawn from the TPP. We have a more limited budget for foreign aid. President Duterte has taken a turn towards or away from America. China is expanding in the South China Sea. How do you think these developments and current foreign policy in the U.S. is going to affect long-term China's ascendancy, excuse me, China's ascendancy in this part of the world, and how might that affect the security of countries both in East Asia and the rest of the world?
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, now we start with Alice. Okay, please. Thank you.
We'll pick up the last question. I'll try and weave in as many as I can. And I want to recognize, as I start, two very important people who are here, which is Lynn Newman and Sarah Howe from the AmCham in Indonesia. Because what's happening now is that I get these questions often, oh, well, with the US is pulling out, China is going to come in. And it's an either or. So if the US is pulling back, then China is going to take precedence. And what the TPP-11, which, knock wood, is going to get signed on March 8th in Chile, is showing us is that most of the countries in the region do not want to make that choice. If the US pulls out, then it has to be China. So they're all coming together. And that's why you had Japan and Australia and Singapore and New Zealand, with Malaysia and Vietnam going with them, entering into TPP-11. Because it's not going to be US versus China. We're going to have this middle ground now. And what the business community is going to need to do, and is doing, is supporting that happening. And so, yeah, things are going to get rough, a little bit rougher than they were with the US pulling out of these multilateral and plurilateral agreements. But it gives an opportunity for other countries to lead, and certainly Prime Minister Abe is doing that on trade, right, with Prime Minister Turnbull and Prime Minister Lee. And the business community is coming in behind that, not just the American business community, but the American business community and others are saying, how are we going to work together to keep this plurilateral system going forward that is better than either the US or China leading? And so I'm optimistic that it's not going to be China taking over because the U.S. Is pulling back. I'll leave Aaron, and I'm talking about from an economic perspective. There may be differences when it becomes to the military and national security. And certainly the hope would be that as we move forward in Asia, that countries like Indonesia, and countries like the Philippines, and countries like Thailand come into these plurilateral frameworks that are being created. Now, I'll add one last piece on China. That was another question. Let Aaron talk on this subject too. There's real problems with China when it comes to U.S. companies doing business there. There is, IPR theft that is going on. There is the inability of the Chinese to keep the commitments that they've kept in the WTO and other agreements. And every administration has struggled with that. The Obama administration struggled with it. The Bush administration struggled with it. The Trump administration has talked a much tougher game so far. They put the tariffs now on solar panels and washing machines. Let's see if they take action against steel. Let's see if they take action against IPR. And this could lead to a trade war. And the Chinese have just started launching negotiations against some American agriculture products. So we're in uncharted territory here. But you have to give the Trump administration at least some acknowledgement that they are trying to address an issue that has significantly hurt the United States of America, and that's access to certain Chinese markets. Aaron?
Yeah, so specifically on this China question, I completely agree with what Steve said. I think, there are good trade wars and there are bad trade wars. There are justified trade wars and there are completely unjustified trade wars. Signing a national security waiver on steel would be totally unjustified, and it could potentially start a trade war. And that would be an America First policy. But if the United States is going to go through the WTO process, if it's going to put safeguards on products that have been dumped in the United States, if it's going to do the things that American administrations have always done in the economic relationship with China. You'll remember there were steel tariffs during the Bush administration. President Clinton also put tariffs on some goods with regard to China. There's long been a struggle over market economy status, and so some of this is rate normal, and we should not interpret every trade action by the Trump administration as a sign that America First trade policies are being implemented. And washing machines are a good example. That's sort of normal friction in a trading relationship. It could potentially lead to a trade war, but we should at least recognize which side is the legitimate side in that debate. In terms of the strategic situation, there was real concern when President Trump came into office that he was going to trade baubles, sort of goods issue, that he was going to trade benefits on trade for concessions on security, and particularly in the South China Sea. And one of the reasons we thought that might be the case is because there had been no freedom of navigation operation in the South China Sea for approximately 6 months after Trump came into office. And then on May 25th, there was a freedom of navigation operation. In fact, there have been more frequent freedom of navigation operations, FONOPs as we call them, in the South China Sea under the Trump administration than there was under the Obama administration. I think this is a real signal that the system, even if Trump doesn't really understand these concepts, freedom of navigation, international law, why they're important to the United States, the system that's working beneath him and that reports to him does. And they're able to get him to approve, and they're able to get the administration to do some of these really important things that America has always done in terms of defending freedom of navigation in this region. Jim Mattis's visit to Indonesia was, I think, another sign of that, that the Defense Department in particular, under Jim Mattis, and the State Department under Rex Tillerson, perhaps to a lesser extent, they get it. They understand why these things are important, and they'll continue to do them. So I don't see us losing the region to China, and I think sometimes it's unhelpful to look at it that way. There are also elements of cooperation between China and the United States in Southeast Asia. There's a great Center for American Progress report that came out in 2016 that was done with Kicker, the Chinese party think tank, about ways that the U.S. and China can cooperate in Southeast Asia to the benefit of Southeast Asia. But to the extent that China is pursuing a very aggressive strategy in this region to coerce the Philippines, Vietnam, perhaps in the future to also coerce Indonesia with regard to sovereignty around the North Tuna Sea, that is something that Southeast Asia and America have to work closely on. And yeah, I do have a little bit more doubt with the Trump administration in office than I did under Obama. But I'm confident there are really good people in the cabinet and at the sub-cabinet level who get these issues and have been able to get a few things done. Just in terms of protectionism, I agree with Tom Lembaugh. Protectionism never wins. Protectionism never benefits anyone. And that's the message we've been trying to get across to the administration when we talk to them about these issues. They have a different view, but there is a spectrum here. And the majority of the people in the administration who are implementing these policies are not protectionists. And they understand the risks of trade wars and things like that. So I'm not that concerned about that. I'll leave the domestic politics questions to Steve, since there were many more of those than there were international policy questions.
Maybe I'll answer one of those now. I think the question, how is it that Trump won? By a quick show of hands, how many people know what Donald Trump's campaign slogan was?
MAGA.
Absolutely. How many people, I'm almost going to say I'll give you money if anybody in here knows the answer. How many people know what Hillary's campaign slogan was?
Stronger together.
That was her second one. Very good. What was her first one?
First one?
Yeah, she had one that didn't work and she had to rejigger it over to Stronger Together. Her first one was I'm with her, and then she shifted over to Stronger Together. But that, right, one person, I think maybe a couple knew Stronger Together, but everybody, right, knows Make America Great Again. And Donald Trump was a genius at reading the significant part of the Republican voters. It's that slide I had which showed those people who wanted it to still be 1967 in the United States, but it's 2017. He knew what those people wanted to hear. He put out his slogan to those people, and those people came out to vote for him. That's one of the reasons he won. The second reason he won is because in our system, right, we have these primaries, and he happened to be running against 16 other people at the same time. So Donald Trump's vote in the Republican primaries was, I don't think it ever got above 38% until about towards the very, very end when it became inevitable. So he only appealed to about a third of the Republican voters who are the most conservative who come out to vote. But he wasn't appealing to all of America, and so I would say maybe you can sleep well by understanding that the people who put him in for the Republican nomination are not representative of the United States. And then the third reason that he kind of won is because candidates matter. You know this in Indonesia as well as we know it in the U.S. I mean, who you're running against is very important as to who's going to win or lose. And I even said back then, I didn't think he was going to win. I didn't think he was going to get the electoral votes needed. But I and others had said back then, the only candidate that Hillary Clinton could have beaten was Donald Trump. And the only candidate Donald Trump could have beaten was Hillary Clinton. And so we had this perfect storm where Donald Trump could win. Had another Democrat who didn't have Hillary's baggage, like Joe Biden, maybe even Bernie Sanders, they would have beaten Trump. And had a Republican like Kasich or Jeb Bush or any of the other, Marco Rubio had gotten the Republican nomination, they would have won the popular vote. Remember, Donald Trump did not win the popular vote. He lost by 3 million votes. But in our system of the Electoral College, he won. So, I mean, so don't take, maybe that will make you sleep a little bit better, and that he doesn't represent really the United States, although he is president. And he's going to, the Walton Foundation question, what do the voters, his voters think about him? I mean, it's this whole thing now of fake news, which is extremely dangerous. His voters don't believe when things aren't going his way that he just said, well, that's fake news, I didn't do it, or what have you. Well, they believe him. They believe the media is biased, and that's part of the reason why they're staying with him. And so the people who voted for Trump, right, you can split those into two categories. Those who voted for Trump because they wanted Trump to win, those who voted for Trump because they wanted Hillary to lose. Those Trump voters are 97% with him. He has had no diminution in the base, and he continues to play to that base over and over and over again. And where this is all going to end up, and then we can open it up for other topics too, is on impeachment. And so long as Trump stays with that 80% give or take approval rating amongst all Republicans, and so long as he keeps about 100% approval rating amongst those who vote for him, impeachment is going to be, I would think, impossible. Something has to happen to drive those numbers down. Now, in the history of the United States, right, we've had 2 presidents impeached in our history. Impeachment is not defined anywhere. It's not a legal term. It is a political term. And so impeachment is whatever the Congress says it is. And the way our system works is that the House of Congress has 435 members. The House does in our legal terms, they would issue an indictment. And so the House says whether or not a president should go to trial. And so you have impeachment hearings in the House. Twice that has happened where the House has said, yes, we want him to go to trial. Last time, of course, with Bill Clinton. And then you have the trial in the Senate. And you have to have a supermajority of senators vote to convict. And never in the history of the United States has that occurred. And there's, so long as there's, a fair, a 50-50 split or close to it, it really seems impossible that a Senate would vote to convict him. A House, the Democrats in the House, if the Democrats get the House in this election, could vote to impeach him. But impeachment without conviction, he remains in office, as did Bill Clinton, as did Andrew Johnson. So today, there's no chance he's going to get impeached. But come talk to me. Let's see what Mueller finds out. Let's see where the Senate ends up. Let's see where the House ends up. And then it is possible. But we have to know those 3 things before we can begin to predict that that will happen. And the 25th Amendment, no chance. No chance.
Yeah, just briefly, I don't normally talk about domestic U.S. politics, but just briefly on this, because I thought that was actually a pretty moving remark. So many things had to go right for President Trump to win that election. And if you look at the math in the Electoral College system, again, he lost by 3 million votes in the popular vote. But even in the Electoral College, had he lost 40,000 votes one way or had they gone the other way in just 3 states, Hillary Clinton would have been president. And with a reasonable Electoral College margin, we would have been talking about how brilliant her campaign was and how we defeated this sort of America First agenda. And America was exactly what we thought it was. So it was a very closely fought thing. If Jim Comey had not sent that letter to Congress a few days before the election, we had Jake Sullivan, who was Hillary Clinton's national security advisor at the Lowy Institute last year. And he said, it does keep him up at night because he made thousands of decisions across the course of the campaign. And any single one of those decisions might have swayed enough voters to have changed the outcome of the campaign. And so it was such a closely fought thing. And I hope that people, when they look at things like Trump's executive order on immigration from the seven Muslim majority countries, that they don't just look at that executive order, but that they also look at the thousands and thousands of Americans who, when they heard about that on a Friday evening in January, immediately went to their local airport, and the lawyers among them said, I am offering my services pro bono to defend anyone who wants to enter the United States. That to me is what America should represent, and I have a lot of confidence that it will represent that again in the future. So I think there's a possibility that, I think actually a likelihood that we will revert to form in 2020, and that this can't continue for that much longer. But it's also not, it's probably not right for me to sort of deny that something has changed in America and that we're dealing with a problem right now in terms of America First ideas and ideology, as mentioned earlier. We shouldn't sort of sweep that under the rug. There is an issue, but there are a lot of Americans who feel very deeply, very strongly that there is a better America out there, and that we need to elect leaders who represent that.
Amen.
The question is still much related to what we are just discussing now. That is the question I think still not addressed yet. The question of what is the impact of the midterm election, midterm election to the relation between Indonesia and the US. But it can be also seen from this point that Indonesia is also coming with its election, its national election. The election of the local elections is very strategic in mid-June or the end of June, and I think you will have now. And then the presidential and as well as parliament election next year, April next year. So what do you see also? The election of midterm election in the US and the Indonesian election, impact on the US-Indonesia relation. I think it is the question of Mr. Fran Santo, please.
Okay, remember the U.S. has a system of checks and balances, and we have three different branches. So we have the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. So the executive branch isn't going to change. The legislative branch is putting some checks on the Trump administration. Remember, so the judges found that his initial ban on people from those seven, predominantly Muslim countries coming to the United States was unconstitutional. And so the judicial branch can put some checks on the executive branch, but that takes time, and it has to work its way through the courts. The legislative branch can put immediate checks in some areas on the executive branch by not passing laws, by taking money away from the executive branch, by changing new laws that they then have to comply with. So there's all sorts of things that can happen. Right now, there's almost no checks being put on because you have a Republican Congress, and the Republican Congress knows the Republican voters still love President Trump. Therefore, they're going to let him do basically whatever he wants to do. Now, the question is what happens in the midterm elections? Because in the midterm elections, the entire House of Representatives is up for re-election, and 1/3 of the Senate is up. And both of those houses could stay Republican. Both of them could go Democratic, or one could be Democratic, one could be Republican. Now, I was in the Clinton administration when this happened to us, right, in '94. So in '92, when we came into the White House, we had the Democrats controlling the House and the Senate. In '94, they had something called the Republican Revolution, and the Republicans took over the House and the Senate. And my life in the Clinton administration changed a lot, because what the Republicans did was use their oversight authority over us over and over and over again. They said, we want to see all of your travel records because we want to make sure that when you're traveling, it's not for political reasons. We want to see all of your budgeting requests. We're going to line item out people that you want. And so Congress, with its oversight authority and budget authority, has the ability to make the executive branch's life miserable. And they can make it so miserable that they could launch an impeachment against the president. If the Democrats get the House, all of that is likely going to happen. And if that happens, the entire focus of Washington is going to be consumed on what's happening in D.C. on internal politics. And very little is going to happen, or less and less is going to happen in foreign policy, because people are going to be completely distracted by it. And I think you had one where you had said that part of what's going on with U.S. foreign policy is that maybe the U.S. was overlooking things of how it would be looked at internationally, and they would only focus on it, the domestic impact. And it might be where the Israeli capital is recognized, or other things like that. It's going to only get worse and worse of overlooking what happens outside our borders, or what even happens outside the D.C. line, if the Democrats get the House or the Senate. So I hope that may be a kind of depressing answer to some, although it might be hopeful to others too. Aaron?
My name is Rella from My News TV. I'm representing my colleagues here from press. So Pak Theo, and also the two speakers, I don't have any data with me right now about how the Americans feel secure domestically, because since early January, I noted more than twice school shootings occurred in the USA. Lastly, in Kentucky, if I'm not mistaken. So one of the President Trump's presidential campaign is about security, terrorism, threats for children, and everything, and so on and so forth. I would like to ask you, how is actually the Americans feel about their security in their own home right now? And the second one is about the Guantanamo prison that President Trump he promised not to close He promised to close the Guantanamo prison, but he didn't keep that promise. What is actually happened relating to the policy on the Guantanamo? Thank you.
You want to? You take it. Sure, just on Guantanamo, this was President Obama's policy. His first day in office, he signed an executive order saying that we would close Guantanamo as a prison, not as a naval base. And he was unable to accomplish that. There were political issues that he ran into almost immediately. And President Trump's position is different. He doesn't mind the fact that Guantanamo still exists, but he also doesn't seem determined to keep it open. And there are also a number of people within the system who would prefer that, at the very least, Guantanamo hold as few prisoners as possible. Although I know that, for instance, with Indonesia, with Hambali, Indonesia does not want Hambali back, right? So there's, and Lulu just said that publicly, said, no, America can keep them. And so, there is some issue, how do you empty Guantanamo? Do you just sort of, where do you send these people back to when they finish their sentences? And Americans don't want them on the US mainland because they have unreasonable fears that they will somehow be able to commit terrorist acts in the US, even if they're behind bars. And so there are political issues here that are very difficult to resolve. It's unfortunate that President Obama did not take them on in a more forthright way, but I don't see any prospect that it will be closed anytime soon.
And talking about guns, the thing you have to keep in mind as a start is that President Trump will not really deviate from what his base wants. And his base, I'm talking about those 38%, right, of his approval rating. For political reasons, he wants to keep that 38%. He'd like it to be higher, but he certainly doesn't want to see it come down. And so the question you would ask if you are a political advisor is, what are those things that are most important to that 38%? And one of those things is what they view to be their Second Amendment rights, right? In the Constitution, we have, which defines how our government operates. There's amendments to that Constitution, and the Second Amendment to that Constitution is the right to bear arms. And now we can have a debate about, does that mean you should be able to have a handgun or a sawed-off, automatic machine gun in your home? But some people believe it's an unlimited right. And those people are in that 38%. And Trump's not moving off that 38%. So as horrific and as commonplace as these school shootings are becoming in the U.S., it's not going to change politically unless something happens that is going to make our Congress much less polarized, that can work across party lines, and that there's a president willing to lose votes over it. And so, I think the realistic answer is gun control legislation is not even being considered in the United States right now. The real test, I think, to watch on how much President Trump is willing to move off his base is going to happen this week, possibly, which is on immigration. Because if there's a deal to be done in the United States on immigration, it's going to involve two things. And so there's this, I'll just explain. So there's something called the Dreamers. And the Dreamers is shorthand for a program President Obama put into place called DACA, Deferred Action Against Chinese Children Arrivals, I think. So what happened is that over time, you had all of these children who were between the ages of 2 and 16 coming to the United States. Now I use the word illegally, or you use it without authorization or without documentation. But they all came to the United States with their parents. So they didn't have a choice. Their parents are the ones who brought them. And then, so the question then becomes, now that they have lived and worked in the United States, and they have jobs, and they own homes, and they're good citizens, should you deport them? And President Obama said we should not deport them. And so he created this thing called DACA to protect these dreamers. And these are the dreamers who came with their parents to find the American dream. But what President Obama did was, you could say, illegal. He did not have the authority to do this. And so he created an executive action, and the court said that he went beyond his rights as president to do this. And President Trump said, I am not going to do anything illegal. Congress, you need to fix this problem by March 5th, which is coming in, it's a month away. Congress, you need to fix this problem. So you have to have a bipartisan solution to fix this problem, because you need Democrats and Republicans coming together to get that legislation through the Senate. Now, the Democrats are saying, we want the Dreamers protected. And the Republicans are saying, we want more money when it comes to border security. We may even want changes to our immigration laws to stop family-based immigration. Right, so today, if somebody comes to the U.S. and legally and becomes a citizen, they can bring family with them. There are Republicans. I don't think there's any Democrats in the Congress. There's Republicans who want to change that and not permit family-based immigration anymore. So you're having a compromise between DACA, border security, more money going to border security, maybe even to fund the wall, and changes to family-based immigration. But whatever Trump does, that compromise has to protect the Dreamers. Will President Trump sign a law that protects the Dreamers that goes against his base? It's going to be a real political test for him. If he does that, then maybe we can find other areas to compromise, like on infrastructure. But that's going to be I could see a compromise on immigration. I'm not seeing any compromise on the Second Amendment in gun rights.
Thank you, Mr. Okun. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let me give a big applause to those who Connelly and Mr. Stephen Okun. And I would like also to this very good donate to our two gentlemen. Okun is based in Aaron is based in Singapore, Sydney, and then Okun is in Singapore. And special coming here for this event, we really appreciate for this. And then also to our all audience, attendance of this very important discussion. Thank you. Thanks very much. For the moderator, I conclude this meeting, but I return this back to our MC, please.
Thank you very much. If you would please, let's give another round of applause to our two excellent speakers and also our wonderful moderators at the Sambuaga for today's event. On behalf of USINDO, we'd like to thank you for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you in future USINDO events. Thank you very much. Have a good day.